Welcome to this short virtual module that's being recorded as part of a suite of resources for the Behaviour Hubs programme. My name is John Dabro. I'm one of the advisors on the programme, and today I'm going to talk to you about SEND, which is the title of this module. And I'm joined by my colleague Jane, who's going to introduce herself and say a few words about herself. Please, Jane.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Lowe, one of the behaviour advisors on the behaviour advisor team for the DFE. My experience is in mainstream special and in AP, and also in custodial settings in terms of leading on education too.
Thanks, Jane. My experience is predominantly in special education. I was a head teacher for some 30 odd years. And one thing I'm absolutely certain is it's much easier talking about anything to do with education than actually doing it like a real practitioner. But I was a practitioner and I did enjoy it, and I do miss being with the kids. Okay, so this session is a short introduction really to SEND in the broadest sense of the word. And I have to say it's a short introduction. You know, we can give you some pointers, but this will not cover the totality of what you need to know about youngsters experiencing and having SEND and additional needs. And really it's a taster. And what we hope is we're going to signpost some places that you might want to look to go to further in order to understand the whole nature of working with youngsters, as I say, with an experiencing SEND. And I say with an experiencing, and I'll come back to that that sort of definition a bit in a minute. But this is what we hope to be going through today, that we're going to give you a definition about the code of practice. We're going to talk about the manifestation of that in the report, you know, right place, right support and right time. Talk a bit about inclusive practices, what we can do to improve the learning outcomes for youngsters. Talk a bit about multi-agency conclusions, and then, multi-agency working, and then move to conclusions. Okay, can we move on, Jane, please? So this is what we hope that you'll get from this session. We're going to talk about the statutory responsibilities you have as a school in relation to SEND, how you ensure that your policies are inclusive, what some of those barriers may be, and what some of the strategies that you can adopt that would help you, particularly working around youngsters presenting persistent disruptive behaviour. And can I say again, just reiterate that point again, in this short session, we really will be able to tease you into some of the theory and some of the practice, but you'll actually need to do some more work in your own right in order to get a more comprehensive understanding of SEND and where it fits in with the wider milieu of education. So before moving on to looking at defining special educational needs, I just want to point out some of the documents that we're going to allude to during this presentation, and there'll be a reference section at the one of the large slides will show you those. But we're going to be using the youth guidance, special educational needs in mainstream school, improving behaviour in schools, working with parents to support children's learning, special needs and disability in the code of practice. And I would suggest you should also be familiar with Tom Bennett's work on creating a culture. I think those are a really good starting point in background. And I guess another good starting point in relation to special needs is recognising that it's only since the 1974 Education Act that all children in this country were entitled to education. Can you believe that there was a category of children up to that point that were classed as ineducatable, and some children were not literally entitled to education. Fortunately, we've moved beyond those dates, and things like the Salamanca Judgment and the 1991 particular Education Act, and to a certain extent the Disability Discrimination Acts have moved to ensure that we have a more holistic attitude towards children, and that all children are entitled to education by law now, whether they have a disability or a special need or additional needs. And I just want to say a little bit there about that definition, because some commentators would say that youngsters with special education needs are created because of social construction, and that whilst we can quantify some disabilities and say someone's visually impaired, I can quantify that, or someone says a wheelchair user, I can quantify that. To say that someone's behaviour is inappropriate or appropriate or challenging or not challenging could be a social construct, and we always need to be really sensitive to the fact that certain groups are overrepresented still within the special educational needs and disabilities cohort. And again, as I say, we need to be sensitive towards that. So someone is deemed as having an SEN, a special educational need, if their learning difficulty or disability, which calls for special educational need, needs to be made for them, or that they've got a significant difficulty in learning than the majority of their peers, and that the disability or the additional needs that they have mean that their progress may be hindered if we don't make what we'll talk about later on as reasonable adjustments towards that end. Okay, Jane, can I pass over to you and ask you to say a bit about the code of practice, please?
Yeah, thanks, John. Let's have a look at it. It feels like quite an old document now. So the first step really in securing success for pupils with SEND is to check that school leaders are compliant with the code of practice. So the statutory code contains a number of elements, and it outlines the legal requirements that you must follow without exception. And there's also statutory guidance in there that you must follow by law unless there's a good reason not to. So it also explains the duties of local authorities, health bodies, schools and colleges to provide for children with special educational needs under Part 3 of the Children and Families Act. The whole document is a tome. It's 192 pages long, but here what we've done is outline some of the key responsibilities for school leaders. So some bullet points there that it would be useful for you to just refresh yourselves of. So opportunities that are provided in school should include pupils with SEND without exception. And the SENCO within school, while essential, is certainly not the only person responsible for doing that. In fact, the code states that while the role of the SENCO is absolutely critical and fundamental, it's the classroom teacher who remains responsible and accountable for the progress and development of the pupils in their class, including where pupils access support from teaching assistant or specialist staff who might be visiting the school too. Schools really need to have systems in place for identifying pupils with SEN, and they must include how parents are then informed about that identification of need. I'd like to say something about the SEND information report, and that report must be published annually on the school's website. And the information that's required within that is quite prescriptive, and it must include the following. So the kinds of special educational needs that are provided for in school, the policies for identifying pupils with SEN and then assessment of their needs, arrangements for consulting with parents and also with pupils, making sure they're at the heart of planning and assessment. Arrangements for assessment and review, so assessing a child's need, reviewing the provision and the impact of it. Transition arrangements are key and should be captured there too, making sure that we are thinking and planning for children moving between phases of education and also preparation for adulthood. The approach that's taken to teaching pupils with SEND, that needs to be outlined, along with adaptations that might be made to the curriculum or the learning environment for pupils with SEND. The expertise and training of staff to support pupils with SEN, including how special expertise will be secured, and that might be commissioning external partners or upskilling teams of staff within school. We also need to identify how we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of provision that's made for children with SEND, and how children with SEND are enabled to engage in activities available with pupils in the school who don't have SEN, making sure that they can access all of those activities. Support for improving emotional and social development, absolutely critical for all schools up and down the land. And how the school involves other bodies, including health, social care, local authority support services, voluntary organisations in meeting the needs of pupils and also supporting families. And then arrangements for handling complaints should be outlined within that report too. I want to bring us a little bit further up to date by having a think about the SEND review started in 2022, which identifies and recognises the failings of the current system, particularly the experience of children and their families, and this visual aims to capture some of that. So those most significant challenges are these three: navigating the SEND system and alternative provision. Families have found that not to be a positive experience. The outcomes for children and young people with SEND or those in alternatively provision are consistently worse than their peers across every single measure. And despite the continuing and unprecedented investment, the system is not financially sustainable. So challenges on many levels there. And the review highlighted some of these. What the review does do is propose the way forward and the intention to address those three key challenges. And first of all, tackling that vicious cycle in the hope that we can create a more virtuous one, ensuring that children can access the support that they need in their local mainstream setting without bureaucracy and the need for any HCP or placement in AP or specialist provision. However, where children do need specialist placements, they'll have access to that with minimal bureaucracy too. And these improvements begin with improving the quality of provision in mainstream with early and accurate identification of need, high quality teaching and targeted support where children need it. And where children need specialist support, they'll have timely access to that too. And it will be underpinned by strong co-production with families, so putting them at the centre, and accountability at every level, including data collection to provide a timely picture of how the system is performing. A single national SEND and alternative provision system, which ensures there's greater consistency in how needs are identified and met at every stage of a child's journey. And in order to establish that consistent system, the DFE proposed to establish a new national SEND and alternative provision system with nationally consistent standards on how needs are identified and then met, creating new local SEND partnerships and bringing together education, health, care partners with local government to put together a local inclusion plan, setting out how each local area will meet those national standards. Supporting parents and carers to express an informed preference for a suitable placement by providing them with a tailored list of settings, including mainstream, specialist and independent provision. Introducing a standardised and digitised EHCP process and template to minimise the bureaucracy and again ensure consistency of delivery. And then streamlining the redress process to make it easier to resolve disputes earlier, including through mandatory mediation, whilst retaining the tribunal for the most challenging cases. And then supporting excellent provision from early years to adulthood. The review has heard that a more inclusive education system is needed to ensure that children and young people with SEND are set up to thrive. And in order to achieve that, the DFE is committed to a number of things, including investment in schools' budget to support children and young people with the most complex needs, improving mainstream provision through excellent teacher training and the development of a What Works evidence programme to identify best practice and spread that around. Building expertise and leadership by consulting on a new SENCO national professional qualification, and setting out a clear timeline so that by 2030, all children and young people will benefit from being taught in a family of schools, with their school including special, alternative provision in a strong trust or with plans to join a strong trust. Also, intention to fund additional respite placements and invest in a network of family hubs so that more children and young people and their families get that wraparound support that they need. Investment in the internship programme and improving transition at further education by introducing common transfer files and piloting the rollout of adjustment passports. And then finally, that reformed and integrated role for alternative provision. So at their best, alternative provision schools are experts in supporting children and young people whose behaviour or other needs can present as a barrier to learning. But too often, the role of alternative provision is unclear and it's used too late or in a way that's not best focused on children's needs. So to address that, the following proposals have been made. And that, first of all, making alternative provision an integral part of local SEND systems by requiring those new SEND partnerships I mentioned to plan and deliver an alternative provision service focused on early intervention. Giving alternative provision schools the funding stability to deliver a service that's focused on early intervention, and that's going to require local authorities to create and distribute an alternative provision specific budget. And developing a bespoke performance framework for alternative provision, which sets robust standards that are focused on progress, reintegration into mainstream, and sustainable post-16 destinations. They intend to deliver greater oversight and transparency on children and young people's movements into and out of alternative provision. And there's a launch for a call of evidence on the use of unregistered provision to investigate existing practice. John, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks, Jane. What was really going through my thoughts when you were saying that, Jane, was just the plethora and the depth of background reading and background information there is around SEND. And I guess, you know, a big part of that is going back to, you know, the comments I made earlier. That, you know, we're coming from a long way back, even in this country, where, as I say, it's only since the 1970s that all children have been entitled to education. So perhaps it's that explains some of the complexity that's behind the work that we need to do. And I have to say, from experience, in the best practice it makes able to use on the existing resources in the existing structures that you already have within your schools, to say, what can we do to tailor what we're already doing around the specific general needs and educational needs and special educational needs that we have in the school for all children. And a phrase I often used to talk to some of my mainstream colleagues about was that if you get it right for youngsters experiencing and having special educational needs and additional needs, you get it right for all children. And just as you raise the bar for your most able children, you help some who are less able. So I think it works, you know, both ways round. So I want to talk a bit about inclusive policies now. And I say, you know, it's hard to recognise, but in some ways, it's only been in the last, you know, since the 70s that all children are entitled to education. So on this journey of inclusive education, what do we need to do? Well, I would suggest to you, you know, that in any school, whether it's a school for youngsters, you know, with lots of additional difficulties and special education needs, or in a mainstream school or in a public school, that whatever you, and an AP, that whatever you need, the single first starting point is that children feel safe. And that's why we have policies. We have policies to make sure that we are consistent in our approaches. You know, the media would have you believe that the big reason why people are leaving teaching is because of the amount of disruption in our schools, and yet that's actually not the case. You know, 75% of staff, even in an ETH piece of research that was carried out in 2014 was saying, 2019 was saying that they thought that schools weren't any less safe than they were previously, and 75% of teachers were saying no, schools were okay, but disruption did cause a problem. And where this was highlighted by Ofsted, this was where Ofsted was saying this is about consistency. It's not about individual children and individual teachers, you know, not working as effectively as they could in their classrooms, but actually more about a lack of consistency across schools. And I'd suggest to you that in order to promote the most effective policies, being consistent is a big part of that. So there are some things that we need to do. And I think by having these policies that are inclusive, what we do is we can remove the barriers to learning that are necessarily sometimes in the system. And so we need to do, you know, a number of things. I think first of all, we need to make policies really, really clear. We need to avoid ambiguity. Again, we keep going on about consistencies, but we need to ensure it. And we need to be clear about staff roles. So I'm just going to move on and say a few more about those things a bit, please, Shane. Okay, so avoiding ambiguity. And I think, you know, if you understand something, you understand it. But I think if you don't understand it, that's where there's the clarity or the potential for ambiguity. So the first thing I would advocate is you must have rules that are clear. And if rules are clear, then there's less chance of ambiguity. And I'll give you an example from something that happened to me recently. I was in a large secondary school. And I was walking down the corridor with a member of the leadership team, and I just said to them, "What's your rule around youngsters and moving around the corridors?" And the teacher said to me, "The youngsters have to be quiet." And I said, "And how do you quantify quiet then?" He said, "Well, they have to be quiet." And I said, "Yeah, but that can mean lots of different things." So he challenged me and he said, "Well, what do you think quiet means?" I said, "Well, quiet for me would mean in this context that I couldn't hear a conversation that someone in front or behind me was having." And he said, "Oh, yeah, that's quite a suggestion, quite a sensible suggestion." I said, "Well, look, it's not rocket science, but it defines what the rule needs to be in relation to being quiet." So that was just one example. I think a really big thing that we need to be doing in schools, and if you're recreating a culture, Tom would say, is we need to teach the behaviour that we want children to be exhibiting. And equally, I think we need to teach the rules that we want children to follow. And I think we need to explain why we want them to follow those rules, but also what it looks like to get it right, so that children know, if I do this, this will follow, and this is how I can do it to get it right. I think we need to train people around that, and that might sound a bit, I don't want that to come across as being really authoritarian, but I really do believe that children need to understand why we have rules, what the rules are, and what they are in context to all children within the school environment, not just those with additional needs and those without additional needs and those with special needs and those with or without a disability. And I also think it's really, really important that we train all staff. When I say training, I think training for consistency. I think the big thing about consistency is that everyone has a shared understanding of what that looks like. And I think a big part of that is ensuring you do that, and revisiting it is a big part of that. Okay, can we move on, Jane, please? Big thing is that people say is, "Oh, reasonable adjustments. How do we make reasonable adjustments?" Well, let me just give you a very simple one. If I was a PE teacher in role and a youngster arrived at my lesson and he or she had their arm in a sling and a plaster cast, I wouldn't expect them to be doing basketball. I'll be making some separate arrangements for them to be doing that. And I wouldn't say that was anything untoward. I'd just say, well, that's a reasonable adjustment. You can't actually take part in this lesson the way I'd intended, because you're unable, because at the moment you've got a broken arm. But you wouldn't question doing that. So why wouldn't you question, I'd suggest to you, making reasonable adjustments for some children as and when they need them? And a good example might be, say, in uniform. And I have worked with children who find certain materials and certain fabrics really uncomfortable to wear, and actually could cause them, say a rash or something like that. So I would think it would be completely unreasonable to say to someone, "We expect you to wear a uniform that actually is going to make you feel uncomfortable during the day." And I'm not suggesting that we don't have a uniform and we don't actually enforce the uniform code rigorously. But I do think where appropriate, might need to be saying, actually, we need to change, make some allowance for that a child may need something that's more comfortable to wear than something that's not. Equally, I can think of some children who I've worked with who just hadn't learned to wear, how to do up ties. So we gave them clip-on ties to wear. It was just a way of saying, we're going to make some adjustments until such time as you perhaps have learned how to do your ties up appropriately. It may be that you need to make some adjustments to routines, and I'm thinking there about some children who find it really difficult to walk up and down through really, really noisy corridors. And it may be you say, "Well, we'll give you some ear defenders to wear, or we'll let you leave the lesson slightly earlier so that you can get to a place on time, with it being quieter." One thing that I found really helps for youngsters is having check-ins, and this is where you're able to demonstrate to the child that you're holding him or her in mind, and that may be by a teacher or a teaching assistant or someone who's known to the child, just popping in and seeing them once or twice during the day to show them that they're being held in mind, and that we're being proactive in saying, are there issues that at the moment you need to be addressing, and we can do that proactively rather than wait till something goes wrong. And then also talking a bit about teaching assistants and support. And a metaphor I like to use here is that, teaching assistants and using them as part of the wider network agency in schools is around saying these youngsters, these people, these staff are there to support children. They're not there to prop them up. If you look at an old building that's falling down, that's buttressed up with great big bits of wood, if you take those bits of wood away, the building's going to fall down. It should be that the teaching assistants are supporting children in promoting their learning and come to terms around how they mediate themselves within the curriculum. It shouldn't be that they're there to actually be Velcro to the individual so that he or her can't make their own progress as and when necessary. Okay, can we move on, Jane, please? I want to talk a bit about relationships, and I would suggest to you that at the core of the learning experience is the relationships that pupils and students have with their teachers and the other adults in the classroom. But I'm in that context, I'm not suggesting that that within that relationship that the pupils are your friends. You are an adult in role, and there should be an appropriate boundary between you. So they're not your friends, but that doesn't mean to say that you can't be friendly. And there are times where I suggest to you, particularly in the context of working with youngsters with additional needs, that you actually need to have a relationship that is clear about what the boundaries are, but may be different than you may have, say, with somebody who hasn't got a disability. And I'm thinking perhaps in the context there of working with someone who may have Tourette's and swears a lot. Now, you'd never want to condone the swearing and say it's okay, but you might make a reasonable adjustment that says, in the context of our relationship, I want you to be absolutely clear that, effing and blinding is not going to be okay, but I recognise that because of a condition you may have, you may do that. So I think it's really important that we have boundaries, and particularly for adolescents, the more boundaries you have, the easier it is for them, it seems to me, to mediate from being an adolescent into being an adult. It's really important that we do that within the context of a caring, and I'd suggest in some ways loving relationship, but being absolutely clear, the adult in role needs to be in charge and needs to be structuring the boundary. I think it's really important we make provision, particularly for youngsters at unstructured times, and some children haven't learned how to play. And so it's in some ways it's irresponsible to put them into a situation like at break time and say, right, now go out and play with all your youngsters if you don't know how to play. Equally, I think it's really important we have routines and we stick to routines. And then, the use of scripts so that we've got, giving children, particularly around, say, the use of metacognition and resilience building, that we can use certain scripts that will help children to get it right when they're not getting it right. And an example could be, in reparation, you might have a script that says something like, what did you do? What happened? What did you do wrong? What do you need to do to put it right? What can you do next time to stop it happening again? And I think the use of scripts, again, takes it away from the individual and makes it more neutral, but also makes it easier, I think, for many youngsters to understand. And I've alluded to earlier on about the effective use of TAs. TAs are there to support the learning of children. They're not there to make it easier for teachers necessarily. Okay, can we move on, Jane, please? And now I'm going to say a bit more here about a use of the effective. Okay, Jane, I've waffled on for too long. Can I ask you to say something about the effective use of TAs, please?
Yeah, certainly, John. And I want to share another bit of guidance with you for you to go away and have a look at. It's been around for a while, and it's the EAF conducted a review of the effectiveness of TAs and their impact on attainment. This was some time ago. And the review conclusions were fairly dramatic, and it suggesting that TAs did not impact positively on attainment. And most of that was due to a lack of training. However, what that piece of research did do that was incredibly useful is make several recommendations about how TAs could be used far more effectively. And those recommendations that would directly impact positively on the behaviour of pupils with SEN include some of the following that we've got there. And first of all, it was helping pupils with independent learning skills and managing learning, ensuring TAs are fully prepared, tell TAs what they're listening out for during lessons, and what the key learning is and how to support it. and then also deliver instructed interventions. So there are many different types of interventions for behaviour available, and EAF list a lot of those within their toolkit. So things like social stories, to language intervention, improving friendships and social skills. EAF developed a self-assessment tool to help schools get underneath the use of TAs, so to assess their current practice and then monitor progress against implementation of the recommendations that are outlined there. And you can see a link there, making best use of teaching assistants, and that will take you to that self-assessment tool. As I said, really, really valuable. I still use it now with the schools that I support. It just allows you to get an accurate picture of where are we up to right now with support staff in classrooms, and just the opportunity to reflect on that and think about planning for the future. And it will most certainly inform professional development for that body of staff, if you have new staff that might need upskilling, but also the way in which teachers interact with teaching assistants to make that planning and approach to delivery far more comprehensive and joined up. So a tool that's worth going away and having a look at. What I want to move us on to now, if it's okay, is to have a think about primary needs. And the code of practice splits those needs into 4 broad areas. So the first one, cognition and learning, then communication and interaction, social, emotional and mental health, and sensory and physical needs. And those areas provide a useful first step to begin planning provision in school. But schools and staff have got to gain a picture of each unique individual pupil with SEND to decide on the provision and next steps for those individuals. But these broad categories of need will help us start with those initial steps. The most common primary needs, according to the latest statistical release, remembering that there's often overlap in between categories as well. It's an important health warning there, are outlined on the slide there. And it's important to stress that pupils with behavioural issues do not necessarily have SEND, and equally, pupils with SEND will not necessarily need behaviour support. And that's a really important point to make. A tried and tested way to ensure that SEND needs can be identified is by providing high quality teaching for all children, as John mentioned earlier on. You're going to encounter children with overlapping needs, as I just mentioned, and maybe needs that you've not encountered before. But the principles to support them well are really the same. It's find out more about the needs that they have and the barriers that they may present with, and then begin to plan for provision, which is what we're going to talk about next. John, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks, Jane. And I just want to reiterate that point that I made earlier on, as outlined there from the EAF document, that, you know, good teaching for pupils with SEND is good teaching for all. You know, and a big part of that is around high expectations. And I think having, you know, the same expectations for somebody because he or she has a disability is not to do them a disservice, but in fact to do them a service. And I often used to think, even working with some of the children presenting the most challenging behaviour, I had the expectation that they could move to the position where they could ameliorate some of their difficulties, so they could learn to behave more appropriately. And I think a big part of that was having a mindset that said it would be possible, you know, looking for children, how they can become, not necessarily how they're behaving in the here and now. So a big thing around flexible groupings, I just want to say something in there, you know, that we shouldn't be looking to segregate children. We should be saying, what can we do to change our pedagogy so that we can ensure that we've got maximising the opportunities around grouping wise, to make sure that we don't say that children need to stick out and be different from each other. We recognise that there's a way of working flexibly so that we can, within a classroom, recognise the needs of all the children and not say, right, we need to make separate provision for all children. You know, a document I'd really commend you to look at if you're really into cognitive and metacognitive strategies is the EAF document about that. And it seems to me, particularly in relation to helping youngsters understand their learning and understand the learning process, we should be teaching them the steps of learning and show them how they can use strategies to maximize the impact of the materials that they're working with. I think by offering explicit instruction, being really clear to children, this is how we do this is why we do it this particular way, and give them examples. I alluded to earlier on about scaffolding, and I say the big difference between scaffolding and propping up. I think that's really important. And then also looking at how we can use technology as and when it's appropriate to support youngsters. And it shouldn't be that technology replaces a teacher at any judgment. Indeed, you could say if a teacher can be replaced by technology, they should be. Can we move on, please, Jane? So what might a graduated approach look like? Well, I think the starting point is that we say that we start with the whole class and we say, look, what kind of whole class strategy look like? And it may be then that we say that there are some activities that we can include everybody in collectively within a flexible grouping. But it may be that at times we need to look to a targeted approach. And it may be, and I can think of enroll, sometimes we would say within the school day, a child may have access, say, to a therapist, to a music therapist or a speech therapist, or someone who was more skilled in some of the other therapeutic approaches. And we may say that we actually target that intervention for that child that's time limited or over a space of time, so that we're clear this is a specific part of their education diet, for want of a word. And again, a big part of that may be in how we use specialist people, not necessarily always within the school. And I can think of sometimes where it's worked really effectively for us, where some youngsters needed to go to see specialist people from the other allied agencies. I'm thinking there in the context of youth workers sometimes, or and sometimes with some of the specialist police teams that we work with. Okay, can we move on, Jane, please? So a big part, and we talked about this earlier on about the code of practice, but a big part of the approach we should be using is how do we assess the needs of the youngsters? How do we plan it? How do we do what we need to do? And then how do we need to review it? And I think it's encapsulated really well in those 3 bullet points there. And I think it's about being clear there that we need to look at the totality of how the child is, how they are within the setting of a school, how they are learning. And it's not just about their cognitive ability, but it's also about how they are emotionally and how they are socially, and in some ways how they are physically. Do we need to make separate adjustments for them because of say some physical additional needs they may have? And again, I commend you to have a look at that Eve quote there around what we need to do to maximize the learning opportunities for all children through teaching. Thanks, Shane. I'm thinking in role here now, how sometimes how difficult it was to work with some of the families I work with. And that's because, sometimes the youngsters I work with, I felt their parents and their carers weren't as loving and as caring as perhaps they could have been or should have been. And I don't mean that in a judgment way, but I think it's absolutely essential you find any inroads you can to work with parents effectively. In many ways, parents and carers are the experts in relation to their own children. And although you might not, at times I didn't always agree with how parents parented their children, what I knew right early on was I have to invest in the relationship with that child and their parents if we're going to, as a school, make effective inroads. So I think a big part of that is about being upfront, by being as open and transparent as you must be. And I think initially by having early discussions. And I think that's not easy, and it wasn't particularly easy, particularly with very young children in my experience. And I just asked you to be sensitive to the fact that nobody chooses, I'd suggest, to want a child that has additional and special needs, and that we need to be really, really, really sensitive around that. And those discussions and mediating people and parents and carers through that process, where at times they may be grieving for the child that's not the way they'd hope they may be. is you need to be really sensitive around it, is I guess what I'm saying. I think a big part of that is by having early discussions, having regular reviews, look and say, how can we as a school support you to support learning at home? Just as we need your support to help us at school, what can we do to help you? I think we need to tailor school communication where it's appropriate to make sure that we are communicating effectively. And at times, we might need to offer an intense or hypodermic support where needed. And I'm thinking particularly when children may go through certain periods of maturation, or where they've, say, got into trouble outside of school. And I'm thinking in the context there of some of the older children I work with. Okay, can we move on, Jane, please? Okay, the importance of relationships. I alluded to this earlier on, and hopefully I explained, that I think you can be friendly with the people you work with, but you want that their friend. You are in this context, you're an adult in role, either as a teacher or say as part of the wider school network of allied agencies. And it's really important, I think, that you're clear that we're moving away from a model which was about disability and about handicap and about what people couldn't do. And we need to have a really positive mindset, which actually says, through diagnosis and intervention, we need to say, what can we do to maximize the impact of the work that we're doing so that it fits in and offers, in the broadest sense of words, increases the life chances and the happiness that the children will have within their lives. So a big thing we need to be, mindful of is not to label and categorize children. And I can think of a really big mistake I made quite early on in my career, where I actually thought that by highlighting a youngster's need and making some specialist provision for him, that would help him and he'd make a load of progress. And actually, what actually happened in reality was that he became really quite resentful because he felt that he was being scapegoated or being highlighted as someone who had additional needs from the rest of the class, and therefore got quite angry. And I think that whole category of labeling people and being insensitive to how we offer additional support, but also build on making children look ordinary as much as possible in relation to their peers if and when they've got a disability is a really important part. Can we move on, Jane, please? Okay, I think in role, and I'm happy to be challenged in this, but I think it's really, really important that we all have a conceptual framework by which we understand, all children's learning needs, but particularly those who are experiencing special educational needs and or a disability. And there's one particular model that's offered by Ellis and Todd. And you see what this model replicates to me or shows is that at the core, at the middle of the learning experience, we've got the learning behaviour, and we talk about how we can engage, what the relationship is with the curriculum, and how we mediate that relationships with others through the school ethos, the policies that we talked about, and then those four main areas of family, services, community, and policies. But again, I think this is one particular model. But what's important, I think, is you have a model. That's the most important thing. You'd have to follow this one, and there's a myriad of other models that are offered. But to me, it's really important you have your own model and you say, what is it I understand about SEND? What do I understand about the commitment towards making our school and therefore our societies more inclusive? And what is it that through my own understanding, I'm more empowered to make the appropriate decisions and affect the life chances for somebody with additional and special educational needs. So it's absolutely essential you have your own framework. Can we move on, Jane, please?
Okay, let's talk about communication and interaction. So one of the SEN categories defined in the Code of Practice is communication and interaction. So one of those bullets from an earlier slide. And it's a huge category, this one, covering all types of speech, language and communication needs, as well as ASD. And these two needs can overlap as well. And the most common primary needs for pupils with an EHC plan or with SEND support. So the day-to-day life of a pupil with communication and interaction needs can be extremely challenging, as you can see from this triad of impairment described by Alice and Todd. And you might want to have a little read of that, but it does outline the complexities of coping in a very small group, but also within a classroom, within a school environment. It's very, very tricky. And pupils with communication interaction needs are likely to require a lot of support to communicate with others. And teachers should therefore consider how this learning behaviour can be developed by ensuring participation. And that is tricky, there is no doubt. So let's explore it a little bit further. So let's think about ASD, and that falls into this category of communication and interaction. So to prepare for people with ASD in the mainstream classroom, teachers really need to consider how they can build the pupils' relationship with themselves, but also with others within that classroom too. The spectrum of autism is wide, and a strategy that works for one pupil may not work for another. So just as you think I've cracked it, I can use this for some of my other groups, that might not be the case. It might not be as successful with other children as it is for the one that you're working with. Again, it's vital that relationships are built so that teachers can understand the pupils' needs and really think through those next steps. And that relationship's important to get to know the child, but also to develop some trust around using strategies that might be new, but they're going to need some trust in you and vice versa to try those things out. So here are some examples of what might work well for pupils with ASD. So using a strengths and difficulties questionnaire to inform your assessment of the child, thinking about visual timetables, first, then and now boards to identify what's going to happen, how's the day going to run, what's the rhythm for me, the learning rhythm throughout the day. Using social scripts and social stories to help them make sense of interactions and think about how things might play out, or equally to reflect back on something that happened earlier in the day. Ear defenders and workstations. John mentioned these when he talked about reasonable adjustments. Just thinking about the sensory load for these children and some of the sensory challenges that they might face within the classroom, moving around school, maybe in the dining hall, but thinking about what does their work area look like and what does that environment feel and sound like. Using things such as PECS, the Picture Exchange Communication System, to support communication with others and offering that child independence so they can grab hold of their PECS and use that to share their feelings, their views, and the things that they might want. And also thinking about body language, how you use that as the adults, but also how the child might use that too. So let's think about SEMH needs. So back in 2014, social, emotional and mental health was introduced as a category of needs of the Code of Practice a long time ago now. And that includes social and emotional functioning, well-being and the ability to regulate self and behaviour, as well as mental health difficulties. And that term replaces the very old term now, such as EBD or BESD, whatever the terminology you were using at the time. Understanding the pupil and their influences is going to be a real priority for children with SEMH needs. They're going to need to be taught explicit coping strategies to calm their fight or flight response, and some of the strategies are outlined here for you. So collaboration is key too. So planning activities with collaborations elements to it, to help grow their skills and strategies over time to engage in collaborative activities. Maybe exploring situations through role play or puppets to reenact social situations, to put themselves in the eye or in the role of another to think about how a situation played out. Teaching and practicing social situations. We speak a lot about teaching children how to behave and teaching what the rules mean. And there are some common things that children are going to experience every day, which might be line up, where they sit in the classroom, moving around the school, getting to the canteen, sitting in the right place in the canteen. Rehearsing those social situations can really take some of the anxiety away. Forearming with children with knowing what is to come and knowing where to put themselves or to be in a particular situation. Identifying safe spaces to go in school instead of taking flight, and engaging the child in that, so that it's a safe space that's been chosen by them, they've got some ownership of it, and they truly do feel safe there. A really good strategy to have. Identifying triggers with the pupil as well. And you might do this by some of that role play technique that I spoke about. So getting them to play back an event, to think about what was the trigger, where did this start? But again, putting them at the heart of that so they can inform the assessment. And then thinking about scripts for reparation. So when something does go wrong or a situation doesn't play out as we'd planned, thinking about how you'll reflect back on that with the child and working through a script about how they thought it went, how they'd like it to be next time, what do we think went wrong, how could we put it right. But scripts for reparation are a really useful tool. Sometimes pupils with SEND can also have behavioural needs too. And staff should move through that graduated approach that John made reference to earlier, offering the best quality teaching they can, and then provide that intense targeted support before seeking the assistance of outside agencies. So thinking about whole class, targeted, and then specialist input. Record keeping throughout those stages is of the utmost importance. So careful documentation of the actions that you've taken, the support that's been given, meetings that have been had, to allow you to reflect on what do we put into place, what was the impact of that, to inform assessment and guide practice for the future. Sometimes, as we know, this type of behaviour could also be signalling a safeguarding need. So that's something that we always need to check. The SENCO and senior leadership team should be involved to provide advice, support, and also make reasonable adjustments whilst maintaining those high expectations for the pupil. The local authority might also provide support and advice to us. They've often got specialist teams to advise on disruptive behaviour. You might call a team around the child meeting, which involves the professionals that are working with that family, or maybe introduces them to new professionals and outside agencies to formulate a plan, to put together some actions and think about the support. If the pupil already has an EHC plan, the school might call an early review if they're unable to meet the needs of the pupil or the targets are not suitable. John, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks, Jane. This quadrant is taken from an exercise that we've done previously when we've run this module and had mainstream colleagues online who could actually give us specific examples. But it's a good starting point. It comes from the EVE guidance of special education in mainstream schools, and I'd commend it to you as a really good starting point in looking at how you can drill down and look at what you may need to be doing additionally to support an individual youngster, because it may be that he or she doesn't have a diagnosis, and in not having a diagnosis, you just want to say, what can I do to ensure that he or she, can learn more effectively? So it's you need to look at the 4 quadrants and go through that process about saying, what are the barriers, what are their strengths, what support do they need, and what can we do as a school to support them to learn more effectively. And it's a really good starting point, because it will hopefully make you interrogate what you're currently doing and what you need to do to move on. Okay, can we move on at that point, Jane, please? Okay, so in concluding this recording of some thoughts on SEND, can I just say as I said at the outset, this is very much a whistle-stop tour. It's a very quick overview, and you'll need to become much more familiar with the literature and be mindful of the legislation in relation to SEND and working with youngsters experiencing having disabilities in order to get a more rounded understanding of it. But just some points in conclusion. You must implement the code of practice. That's non-negotiable. You should keep abreast of the SEND review. And it's really important to understand that the classroom teacher, all teachers are teachers of children with SEND or experiencing SEND, and it's not the domain just of the SENCO. It's a whole school approach. Highest quality teaching is essential for pupils with SEND. Not really surprising, it's essential for all children. And some people can, say that in order to maximise the interventions and the pedagogy for youngsters with SEND, you do need to make sure you're using high quality teaching. There are, without doubt, now more children with EHC plans than there were previously, and some commentators say that's because we've become more skillful in understanding and being able to diagnose more effectively the needs of some youngsters. But it's really important to remember that the majority of pupils with SEND will all still be in mainstream school and not in special schools or AP or other provisions outside of the mainstream. And it's really important, and I'd suggest to you morally, it's absolutely, you can't justify not making a reasonable adjustment for children as and when they need them. That's not to say that as Tom would say if he was here, exceptions should be exceptionable, but we as making a reasonable adjustment in order to help a child facilitate their learning is I take it as for granted we were doing that. I think it's really important that you know your pupils, and again, the specificity that a youngster with SEND or experienced SEND may have. I think it's really important you have high expectations of them. In fact, I would say I had the same expectations as I say the youngsters I work with as I would have done with when I was working in mainstream school. And it's really important as well, I think, to have this distinction to be clear that pupils with SEND that don't have their needs met can manifest that sometimes with inappropriate behaviour, but it doesn't follow that everyone who has an SEND has their behaviour is not acceptable or that their behaviour is acceptable. It's really important, I think, you understand that just because you have a special education need or educational need, it doesn't mean to say that you'll have behaviour difficulties. And indeed, the majority of children, in my experience, who have got additional needs and special educational needs and disabilities do not have behaviour issues or present challenging behaviour. So it's really important we're mindful of that. And again, I think that goes back to having the appropriate high expectations. Okay, so Jane, can we just move on to the references that we've alluded to? And there's some of them. Interesting enough, I'm looking at Louise Bomber's article there on attachment, and recently I've come across a book which I'll commend you to by Doug Limov and his colleagues, and it's called Reconnect, and it talks about the meaning of purpose and belonging in schools post COVID, and why we need to include all children, but particularly those with SEND, having a different mindset to bring them back into school post COVID. Okay, and can we move on to the last section, please, Jane? And those last three sections, those last three reports, which have recently, or one more recently, which is the alternative provision report, come out in relation to SEND in the broader sense of the words. Okay, so it just goes for me and Jane to say goodbye to you. I hope you found this presentation useful, and thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, bye.